Okay, it's 3:02. I think we can go ahead and get started with this month's Coffee and Compliance. I'm your host, Jamie Leupold, Director of Channels and Alliances here at PreVeil. I'm a CMMC certified professional, and I'm joined this month with our C3PAO partner, LIGN, and our special guest is Mike Gallagher. I'll have Mike give an intro very quickly. Just as always, we encourage questions to be asked throughout the session. The theme this month is going to be on scoping, but as we all know, or I assume most of us know, the CMMC final rule has officially been released. Very excited that this is the first Coffee and Compliance we've had where the final rule has been released. So if you have any CMMC related questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can. And then if there are any others, that we can't get to directly address today, we'll certainly try and address those and get your responses as possible. Again, as I mentioned, the theme for this month is going to be on scoping, and I think that's a really good one because there have been quite a few changes and modifications to some of the asset categories that I think will play a key role in how you go about preparing for your assessment. So as always, also because this is Coffee and Compliance, we will be rewarding a $20 gift certificate to the best question. We do have several that have been sent in, and of course, we'll be taking them throughout the next 30 to 45 minutes. And as always, Mike, you'll be, as our guest, you'll be the one selecting the winner. So with that said, Mike, why don't you do a quick intro, and Orly, if you can start sharing slides.
Sure, thanks, Jamie. Quick introduction of myself. This is Mike Gallagher. I'm the Senior Director of the Federal Practice here at LIGN. Personally, I have over 18 years of experience in security and compliance, senior FedRAMP assessor, as well as a certified CMMC professional, leading our public sector and federal practice here at LIGN as the number 3 FedRAMP provider, and we are an authorized C3PO. So we are looking to really use that experience in that space and coming over to the CMMC space as that's really ramping up. So excited to be here with you today, Jamie, and looking forward to kind of going through these questions.
Thanks, Mike. And I understand, LIGN, as an authorized C3PAO, you are starting to book folks for assessments. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say that we've been getting inquiries and starting to book and queue out those organizations seeking assessments for the last couple months now. So we are queued up into 2025, and now that the final rule has dropped, we're reaching out to those organizations and letting them know, trying to get a feel for how their readiness and when they want to get assessed. So for those of you that have not found a C3PA yet, that you are going to need to be assessed, reach out as soon as possible, hopefully to us at LIGN, and start kind of exploring those options, because I know there is about 50 authorized C3PAOs last I checked, and many of them are really booking up. So reach out as soon as you can.
Excellent. And Mike, if somebody wants to get in touch with the folks at LIGN, I know we certainly have you listed in the PreVeil partner marketplace. Obviously, they can find you at the Cyber AV marketplace as well. Do you want to leave any contact information here for folks that can either reach out to you or reach out to the team?
Yeah, you can reach out on Cyber AV.
Chat.
Yeah, on Cyber AV, you can reach out to, we have our contact information under LIGN. Also, feel free to reach out to me personally, mike.gallagher@a-lign.com. And I'm happy to kind of start conversations as well. So
fantastic. So I think, now that we talked about the fact that assessments can officially get started, we can move on to the next slide, which we will go through kind of the updated timeline. Again, as I announced, as people have rolled in, very excited to announce this is the first Coffee and Compliance that I'm hosting since the rule has been final. As folks may or may not be aware, the final rule was published just about 2 weeks ago now, and it will go into effect on December 16th. So that December 16th is the official date that C3PAOs can actually start conducting assessments outside of the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessment Program, which will cease to exist starting December 16th. So again, if anybody is interested in getting assessed, they can start talking to C3PAOs now. Of course, Mike with A-Line is a great one to reach out to. There are others as well. You can find a host of C3PAOs through the PreVeil partner marketplace, as well as the Cyber AV marketplace. If we just break down the timeline and what this means and helping to kind of clarify some things, CMMC becomes effective on December 16th. That does not mean CMMC starts entering into contracts on December 16th. That is going to require a separate rulemaking to be complete. And what's happened so far is the CFR 32 has been finalized, and that's what we're waiting to become effective here in the next 6 weeks or so. What is required, however, for CMMC to start appearing in contracts is a separate rule called the Title 48. The Title 48 just finished the public comment period, and that will now go through the usual government reviews, the internal agency reviews. It will go to OIRA and then be published just like the CFR 32 was. And then once the CFR 48 is published as a final rule, it will have an effective date, and that will be 60 days from the day it's published. And at that point, CMMC can start appearing in contracts. What we're hearing is the expectation is the Title 48 should be completed in final somewhere in Q2, Q3 of 2025, late spring, early summer timeframe. Mike, I don't know if you guys are hearing anything different, but that's just what I've been hearing.
It is, yeah, that lines up with what I'm hearing. I do want to clarify as well from a contract perspective, though, that 48 drives the contract perspective for those DoD agencies and those contracts with their primes. So if I'm a prime right now, I want to make sure that I'm going to be compliant, and I'm going to start putting that stuff into my contracts to my subs. So that I have some assurance that once that starts popping up in my contract with the DoD, I'm comfortable that I'm covered from from my supply chain as well. So it could be popping up in contracts from private companies that are working directly with the government for their supply chain.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up, is that while technically CMMC will be required in DoD contracts, there's absolutely nothing preventing from a prime requiring their subs to get CMMC certified much sooner than it appears in contracts. I think that makes a ton of sense, and folks really do need to pay attention to that. And many of the folks that I talk to have complete agreement with that, is that it's DoD will be enforcing it, but it'll be the primes that really kind of make the requirement happen much sooner than DoD would ever, make it happen. So, just to give folks a little bit more context around the CMMC program rollout, it is going to be phased in over 4 years. I think the one interesting thing, because this does come up from time to time in conversations that I have with customers and partners, the one thing that we know is that CMMC level 3 will not appear until phase 2. So the requirement is you have to be CMMC level 2 before you could even get assessed for level 3. So I would really focus on CMMC level 2 to start. CMMC level 2 those requirements can start in phase 1, which again does start with that Title 48 rule coming into effect. The phase 1 will be 12 months, and then phase 2 will start 12 months after phase 1 starts, and then each successive phase will be an additional 12-month period. But we do know that level 3 requirements cannot appear in contracts until phase 2 kicks in. Again, the primes will likely, the ones that know they have level 3 contracts, maybe working with their subs ahead of time, but that's from a contractual standpoint, how that breaks out. Anything to add there, Mike?
No, that's a good summary. And yeah, that's kind of we're continuing to see how that rollout's going to affect. And I know there's a few changes that we'll talk about later on that I think really helps in this bottleneck that I was worried about. So
Great, excellent. So what we're going to move on to now is kind of the theme, and really because scoping is such a broad category, we could spend hours just talking about scoping. But what we really wanted to focus on today is specifically around external service providers. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about external service providers and their role that they play, and we're talking specifically at CMMC level 2 right now. For CMMC level 1, the requirements are a little bit different because you don't get into things like security protection assets, security protection data. The categories of external service providers are dramatically smaller within CMMC level 1. We're happy to answer questions around that if you have that, but really the focus is going to be, what does an external service provider mean at level 2? What are the requirements, both for an OSC as well as the actual external service providers themselves? And how does this kind of all play into the CMMC 2.0 final rule? And I think it's first, it is important to understand, clearly what is an external service provider. And I think I'm not going to just sit here and read the definition for you, but I do want you to think about things in a more broad sense. Your external service provider can certainly be your MSP, your MSSP. It can be cloud services that you're using. PreVeil, of course, being a cloud service provider, we fall into the category of external service provider. It could also be shared services. So, when you dig into the scoping guide, which this is from the level 2 scoping guide, they do mention that an external service provider can actually be an internal resource to your company that might be shared, across multiple organizations. So it doesn't mean, that it's strictly a third party. It could be the internal IT department, but that it's shared across, multiple divisions, multiple organizations. But again, the important thing is here that they're outside of your direct control, outside of your on-prem environment, and they can provide a whole host of services. Mike, anything else to add there around ESPs? I know this is probably something that you guys are just starting to dive into, from a C3PAO perspective, but now that the rules kind of been codified.
yeah, I think the biggest point is tracing the CUI, who has access to it, and making sure that it is being properly accounted for within your system security plan, within your diagrams, because that's what's really going to determine the scope. And first of all, it's going to help you as a organization seeking assessment in making sure that you're covered and compliant. But then it's also going to help the C3PAO when doing the review to ensure that having the right scope and if there's any outflow of CUI or access to CUI, that it is being fully assessed and accounted for in the report.
Yep, that makes complete sense. And yeah, exactly. So determining, and it's funny you mentioned that, because the way I like to think of external service providers is it's almost a decision tree. And the first decision we come to, is do they fit the definition of external service provider, which does require that they either store, process, transmit CUI or security protection data, which can be things like vulnerability management. It can be SIM log data, managing your endpoints for you, your endpoint protection and things like that. And it must be processed, stored, or transmitted on those ESP assets. So I think that's kind of the first one we look to, and then we say, okay, now that we've identified this as an external service provider, are they also a cloud service? And that's kind of the next decision we come to, because that's where there's a little bit of uniqueness here. If they're also a cloud service, which they do now recognize the official NIST definition of cloud. I'm not going to read that verbatim, but essentially, if you understand what a cloud service is, think of your SaaS solutions, think of infrastructure as a service. And the important distinction there is that if it's just somebody managing someone else's cloud, that doesn't also make them a cloud. They can be an MSP that manages a cloud. You're now dealing with the cloud service, as one entity. The managed service provider could still fall into scope as an ESP, but that MSP does not become a CSP just because they're managing a cloud. Great example, we've got a lot of partners that deploy PreVeil for their customers. PreVeil is a cloud service. We have to meet certain requirements, which we'll dive into in just a second. Our MSP partners are going to be part of your assessment scope, but they're not going to be considered cloud service providers just because they're helping to deploy PreVeil and manage PreVeil. So when we do determine if something's a cloud, I think the first and most important thing to clearly delineate is that number one bullet. Do they store, process, or transmit CUI? If they do, they must meet the FedRAMP requirements in DFARS 7012, which reflect the DoD memo that came out late last year, went in force early this year, that requires them to either be FedRAMP authorized or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. And we've got a lot of detail and what the FedRAMP moderate equivalency means. It does require a full body of evidence. It requires attestation from a 3POW, very similar to someone like A-Line. A-Line is both a FedRAMP 3POW and an authorized C3PAO for CMMC. PreVeil ourselves, we're FedRAMP moderate equivalent. We have attestation from a 3POW. We've also got the full body of evidence to support that. And many of our customers have leveraged that in successful assessments. So I want to just, again, reiterate that if you store, process, or transmit CUI as a cloud service, you must meet the FedRAMP requirements. That is the only time now you have to meet FedRAMP requirements. And this is a big change from the final rule, from the proposed final rule. The proposed final rule had indicated that if you simply stored, processed, or transmitted security protection data and security protection assets, you would also need to meet the FedRAMP requirements. They have backed off on that in the final rule, which I think is a significant benefit, to industry, and it will hopefully reduce some of the burden, the cost burden to use these security protection assets. So again, if you do not store, process, or transmit CUI in a cloud service, that cloud service does not have to meet FedRAMP. Instead, it does become assessed as part of your assessment scope. And Mike, what does that mean for folks, when you say it becomes part of the assessment scope? So I think it gets a little bit confusing there.
Yeah, so from say a security protection asset, security protection device, say for an example, a SIM tool that's your primary central logging tool. According to the scoping guidance, it relevant controls from 80171 are then applied to that security protection asset or security protection device. If I'm talking about a SIM tool, I'm probably looking at is access to the information in the SIM tool and administrative access in the SIM tool, is that process in place to protect the access, make sure that people don't have access to go in and update the logs and delete and modify. Is the information protected, basically? So what you do is you go through and with the 80171 control framework and make sure that controls that can be applied to these assets and devices are applied, and then those get assessed as part of the assessment, and that's how it kind of gets looped in.
Great. Yeah, thank you. The relevant has always been a particular word that causes some confusion, and I think you addressed it extremely well. I would expect we'll hopefully see something from the Cyber AB added into the CAP, the CMMC assessment process, but I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and to that point, we're still waiting on the updated CMMC assessment process, which is kind of the Bible for C3PAOs and executing how down to the letter of how assessments need to go, and that is where kind of additional details of scoping and things like that we would expect to pop up. So kind of looking forward to that. Uh, I do want to point people to, as they are, you mentioned kind of almost a decision tree for the ZSPs, and going to the CMMC scoping guide. I would definitely recommend utilizing those tables in the scoping guide that kind of talks through what is an ESP, and how does it get looped into the assessment? What does that all mean? Because we can talk about it here, but there's a lot of detail in those tables that really should help in those OSAs, kind of making sure that they're scoping out their environment correctly.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, agree there. There was a lot of detail in the scoping guide. I could have built a lot of slides, but we tried to keep things succinct here for our purposes today. I think the second big relevant change from the proposed rule to the final rule is certification requirements around ESPs. So when we separate the cloud services from the rest of the ESPs, and now we're talking about your traditional MSPs, MSSPs, folks that are helping manage systems, provisioning systems, providing security, your SIM, they might be doing, remote management for you, all those types of services that come into play. Those are all now, considered ESPs that are certainly not a cloud service provider. And I think the important takeaway, from today's session is that they are no longer required to have their own CMMC assessment. When the draft final rule came out, there was basically a requirement that if your MSP either stored, processed, transmitted CUI or provided security protection assets and security protection data, they would then need their own CMMC certification, which would, number one, was going to be a cost burden that ultimately would have been passed down to industry. But number two, it becomes kind of a chicken and the egg scenario where you've got all these MSPs that now need to be certified before their customers can be certified. And that creates a huge potential bottleneck. So I think a lot of that has been removed. Not to say that it doesn't make sense for certain service providers to still go ahead and get that certification, because if they have a lot of customers and they plan on bringing on a lot of DoD customers, number one, it does kind of show that they're taking this very seriously. It will also potentially help ease the burden in some respects for their customers through inheritance and through proving that inheritance a little more succinctly. Not to say they can't do that with a robust shared responsibility matrix, that has been vetted and by third parties. So I do think they've now made it a business decision versus a requirement, and I think that's important for industry. Mike, I don't know if you have any other thoughts around that and kind of how that all played out.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, with in the proposed rule, myself and many others in the CMMC community were wondering how this was going to get off the ground if ESPs were going to be required to have CMMC level 2 certification. And you had many OSAs that then were looking for CMMC level 2 certification, but then they were using ESPs that did not have that. Then did they have to wait for their assessment? So this really solved that backlog and bottleneck issue that you mentioned. I would say that it's recommended still, especially if you're an ESP or working or shopping around the ESPs, that CMMC level 2, especially if they're doing business with a number of different clients in the DIB, they don't want to get stuck into in a big audit cycle of where they continually are getting reached out by their customers' auditors because they get brought into that scope, and those assessors then need to continually request new bodies of evidence to show compliance with CMMC level 2. So if they have that CMMC level 2 certification, they can just pass over that certification to their customers, and then their C3PAO is able just to use that body of evidence in their own assessment. That saves them the hassle of having to deal with assessors multiple times a year, depending on how many customers they have. But to your point, I think it also comes from a uh, marketing and at the comfort around who you're doing business with, and that you're not going to, if you're doing business with an ESP that has a CMMC level 2 certification, you're not going to be surprised when your C3PO comes and they do their assessment and then you don't get your CMMC level 2 because your ESP isn't compliant with certain things, which is always a risk. So there's still, you're still responsible for your CMMC level 2 certification, to that your ESPs are also compliant, because they do get brought into the assessment. So having that knowledge and ability to confirm that before you really get into a full C3PO certification assessment is definitely highly beneficial and recommended.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I agree. And I think this is a good time now. We can kind of jump into the Q&A. We did have several questions that were previously submitted that we'll be getting to. But we also just had one come up that I think we can kind of, tie the loop here, and just clarify. So, this question that just came in, and feel free to submit additional questions if you have any questions. They don't have to be around scoping. That was just the theme for today. But if you have any other questions, about the final rule that is dropped, more than happy to answer those. But I think this question is relevant and timely, and I think just to provide some clarification, if an MSP supports technology for the customer and that customer has CUI data on its assets, can the MSP technical team maintain those assets in the absence of a level 2 certification? So I would still be bifurcating that the MSP has maybe people and personnel that are supporting a customer. That's what I'm assuming here, and they do have, of course, hands on the CUI. But my understanding, Mike, and correct me if I'm wrong, the MSP themselves would still not require a level 2 cert. However, any of those MSP technical team members that have hands on the CUI are now treated as part of the OSA's assessment scope as if they are CUI assets. So they still fall into scope as an external service provider, but they are treated just as if they were, one of the company's employees that has access to the CUI assets. Is that correct?
And that's correct. Yeah, that's how the scoping guide is written. And that's a great question, because I don't think people usually think of the people part for ESP. They're thinking of the cloud service or devices, but having, yes, those people then would be brought in, would be expected to follow all the relevant controls within the 800 and 171. But it doesn't have to transfer over to the contract organization as a whole that they're working for.
Great. Yep. So we had another question, and I think this is a good one. This came in earlier. This is also one of the big changes, and I was really glad to see DoD taking a stance on this, because I know this had been something that had been discussed at length within industry, and there was never a concise, definitive answer. But one of, I think, everyone's favorite topics, VDIs. And this specific question was, can you explain what's required of an endpoint that only connects to VDI? It says via VPN and RDP. I don't know that that's necessarily required, but connects to VDI for access to an enclave containing CUI. I'm going to assume that what they're looking for is, how do we create a VDI environment where the endpoint is out of scope, which is, of course, the big change from the final rule versus the proposed rule, where the DoD did come out and say, if you connect to a VDI that's properly configured, the endpoint is considered out of scope for your CMMC assessment. Do you want to take that one, Mike?
Yeah, and this is definitely one that many in the community were really hoping the DoD was going to provide some more clarification on. It's really key, though, that VDI is properly configured. So if you are accessing a VDI directly from what DoD says is you're just using a keyboard and mouse, and that is kind of your input devices and your access to the VDI. You can't have any access though to save anything local, bring anything over. It is strictly that keyboard mouse to then access and move around in a VDI environment. Um, if you have that, then that is out of scope. That endpoint is out of scope, and it doesn't need to be um, brought into the assessment from the CMMC. So
Thanks. Yeah, and again, I was glad to see the DoD finally come out and say, yes, VDI is out of scope. I know before people had said, well, maybe the endpoint will be considered a contract or risk managed asset. And I think DIBCAC was even taking that stance in some JSVAs. Some were even going further, trying to put it as an in-scope asset. So that that was good to see. So a question just came in, and I think this is kind of ties in a little bit, and I'm glad this question came in because I think it is an important one and something to make sure is clear. And this question said, if information if the data flow is documented internally as to only go through, let's say in this instance, PreVeil, but it could be any cloud service. Is the assessment scope now focused on controlling systems such as administrative controls over security systems such as endpoint protection, MFA? I'll add some things like vulnerability management, user training awareness, etc., but not storage and transmission of CUI, so as to significantly reduce the assessor's scope. So I'll take this one. I think this one, it is important to understand that when you are using a cloud service to store, process, transmit CUI, that does help significantly reduce the burden of the assessment scope because you're going to be inheriting a lot of controls from that cloud service. However, unlike the VDI, where you can now take the endpoint out of scope with a properly configured VDI, it doesn't extend to your typical cloud service, a SaaS solution, whether it's PreVeil, whether it's another third-party cloud solution. This person is correct in that the endpoint is still in scope because the endpoint is still processing CUI. Even if you're not syncing anything locally, the difference is the processing is being done locally on your local endpoint. So you do need endpoint protection. You do need MFA. You do need all of the other components, that are local. It reduces the network, of course, and the storage is made much simpler by going to the cloud. But I did want to point out and emphasize that you do still are required, for those endpoint controls, etc. Mike, anything to add there?
no, I think you covered it. That's my understanding as well, and lines up with how we're scoping things out. So
Excellent. Got a few more questions coming in. Let me see here. So something about if you have a zero trust network between user workstations and servers, it sounds like they're talking about a complex network that does not require any cloud service providers, and you use FIPS 140-2 encryption end-to-end. Will the FedRAMP moderate requirement be needed in terms of processing CUI data between users and servers? So FedRAMP is specific to cloud services. If you've got a complex internal network, but you're not leveraging the cloud, FedRAMP would not come into play. FedRAMP's only a cloud service requirement. In fact, it's only available to cloud services. I hope I answered your question correctly. If not, maybe provide a little more clarity, and we'll try to get to that. But yeah, FedRAMP is strictly a cloud service offering, cloud service provider requirement. Okay, so here's a good one. I think this is where we get into the delineation between CUI and SPD and SPA. This question, when when looking at CUI data or FCI data, and the data systems are classified as CUI, FCI. We'll just say CUI in this case because FCI has different requirements that aren't relevant to SPDs. If the system contains CUI and SIEM pulls logs from those devices or network pieces that process CUI, sends to a cloud SIEM device, is that log data considered CUI and expands the scope of assets covered? Mike, I think as long as they're not taking actual CUI files, which I don't think a SIM normally would do, it's just taking logs. Logs are not considered CUIs. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, so it would fall under those security protection device, where you would assess it against those quote unquote relevant controls. Um, I wouldn't expect it to be pulling CUI type data. It's security data that you need to apply the right controls to, though.
Yep. Yeah. That's what I thought. So appreciate that. Question about what does the term processing mean? And the DoD uses a very broad term for definition for processing. I don't have it directly offhand, but it is more broad than the NIST definition. It obviously anything that includes modifying, but even just viewing and accessing is included in the DoD's definition of processing. So it doesn't require modifying something, which I think is more in line with the NIST definition. But if you access it, if you view it, the DoD has deemed that you've processed it. Anything to add there, Mike, around the definition of processing?
No, and then I guess the uh, going back to the VDI piece, they say the VDI, the processing is all happening on the VDI machine. So even though you are kind of viewing it on your endpoint, they're specifically calling that out as all processing still being on the VDI. So that's kind of an exception to that general rule. But to your point, yeah, it's a broad definition of viewing it, accessing it, etc. So.
Great. Let's see what else we had. We've already kind of covered that one. So here's a good one. This comes up often as well. And I'm going to summarize this, but it's essentially I think the way that the question is intended is that you have your CUI environment that's been certified, but let's say you're running more in an enclave versus trying to certify everyone in your organization to keep costs down, keep complexity down. But then the government, your prime, somebody else sends you CUI to part of your environment that is not in scope. And is that a matter of controlling that through policies and procedures and to cleanse the data afterwards? Is that considered an actual breach? Our interpretation has always been that you manage that through your policies and procedures, through your internal incident response plan. You're not required to, notify DoD or anything of an official breach. You simply notify the sender, that they sent something improperly. Here's the proper way to do it, and then you just make sure that you move that, to a compliant environment and remove it from the non-compliant environment. And any thoughts around that?
No, and that kind of goes back to the assets. I am blanking on the term right now, but by the policy and procedures where you identify anything where CUI in your SSP, where CUI could be received or could be sent outside of, say, an enclave in some capacity. However, it is being restricted through policy and procedures, and that is why you are able to put out a scope. So it's important to define those type of assets in your SSP and in your data flow, so that if your C3PO comes in, they stumble along. Oh well, CUI could be exiting over to to this network over here or to these machines that you do not have in scope. Why don't you have this in scope? You point to, we have policy procedures that restrict this, and this is how we're enforcing it. That way you are identifying it up front and saying these are out of scope and why, and then the C3PAO, it can just kind of move on from there.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really important too, tying it back to scoping and why scoping is so important. And it really is, foundational to getting your assessment done properly. Have a strong SSP, have a strong scope, and you're halfway there. So not seeing.
Yeah, that's one thing as a C3PAO that, like, if we start digging in and we see lots missing from an SSP, or we start to ask questions on what is um, where it's kind of showing that the OSA has not necessarily kind of thought through entire process flow or data flow, then we unfortunately have to start digging more, because then we kind of lose some confidence that that everything's been kind of thought out. But demonstrating that ahead of time within the scoping and system security plan really boosts our confidence in the accuracy and completeness. So
Yep, exactly. No, thank you for that. And I think we just have one final question, and then Mike, I'll have you pick today's winner. But this one is: what is the best way to scope CMMC to just email and storage? For example, a cloud service. And I do think that is, if you have a simple environment, a less complex environment where you are capable of scoping your CUI and managing it digitally just in email and files. A lot of our customers do that here at PreVeil. We provide a platform for storing, sharing, processing, transmitting CUI in emails and files. And if you are able to reduce your scope to just a cloud service that can manage that, then certainly that will help you reduce your scope, reduce your complexity, hopefully reduce your assessment burden, things like that. But also, always be cognizant that you're still likely processing that CUI in a local endpoint, unless you're going to a VDI. And if you do want to really reduce your scope as much as possible, then VDI is an option there as well. Any other thoughts, Mike, on how to reduce scope?
nope, I think that's, yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. Nothing to add.
And I guess the other thing too is, make sure that you're restricting CUI to just those users that have a need to know and need to access it in their day-to-day. Don't bring in folks into scope that have no reason to be in scope, and that's another way to dramatically reduce that scope. Okay, well, that concludes the October Coffee and Compliance. Hopefully, this was helpful for everyone. And before we go, Mike, I'll just have you pick the winning question.